The Given school rose on the edge of the village like a monument to virtue. Its stone walls tall and disciplined, its windows narrow, allowing light in slivers as if to ration even the day. In 1854, Sir Thomas Givens was celebrated in the newspapers as a benefactor of the forgotten, a man who had given his fortune and name to the care of orphans. Carriages arrived filled with children from workhouses and ruined homes, and townsfolk applauded his generosity as they watched the young carried behind the iron gates. They believed they were witnessing mercy, that Givens's hand was steady with compassion. But beneath the mask of philanthropy lay an obsession darker than cruelty itself, a belief that purity could only be drawn from the marrow of suffering, that innocence must be reshaped by force. Givens was not content to house children. He wanted to cleanse them, to unmake them and rebuild them into vessels of obedience. The rules announced on the first night seemed harmless in their wording but hollowed the children of selfhood. No laughter after dusk, no speaking of one's name without permission, no song, no unsanctioned prayer. Beds were arranged in rows so exact that the smallest deviation resulted in hours kneeling on stone floors until the bones bruised. Meals were taken in silence, each spoon lifted and lowered in rhythm, the scrape of cutlery louder than any voice. The walls absorbed this silence until the school felt less like a refuge and more like a tomb already waiting to be filled. Those who disobeyed found themselves locked alone in a dark alcove behind the chapel, where dripping water and echoing breaths became companions for nights at a time. Children emerged, changed, shoulders hunched, voices low, their will shaved away like bark stripped from a tree. Sir Thomas walked the halls each evening with the calm presence of a priest inspecting his flock. His shoes clicked evenly, the rhythm measured as if even his footsteps were a lesson. To the staff he spoke of morality, of discipline as the highest form of love. But his eyes lingered not on the children's faces but on their silences, on the way a girl lowered her head without question, on the way a boy clenched his jaw to keep from crying. These were not mistakes to him but signs of progress, proof that suffering had begun to refine them. He was fascinated by the quiet, by the hollowing of the child who had once laughed too loudly or spoken too freely. In his study he wrote careful notes, describing silence as if it were a science, each experiment producing results he catalogued in tidy columns. The school soon gained a reputation for order, which was mistaken for success. Parents who had abandoned their children found comfort in the thought that Givens was shaping them into upright citizens. Officials praised him as a model for reform. None asked why the school's annual class photos always seemed unsettling. In every photograph, rows of children sat stiff, eyes blank, uniforms immaculate. But beneath each picture, where names were carefully inked, one space always remained empty. One child stood unnamed. At first it was assumed to be an oversight, a quirk of record-keeping. But the pattern never broke. Year after year, one child's name was missing, and that child was never seen again in the following photograph. The missing were spoken of only in whispers among the children themselves. They said the unnamed ones were not dead but erased. Some claim they had been taken into the chapel at night dressed in white and made to kneel as Sir Thomas placed his hands over their heads. Others swore they heard faint cries from the walls as though the bricks had swallowed the children whole. One boy carved the word "remember" into the underside of a dormitory bench, but when it was found the next morning, the bench was burned in the yard as a lesson. No one was allowed to speak of the unnamed again. The silence was enforced not only by fear but by ritual, the rules binding them tighter than chains. Givens justified these disappearances as part of what he called moral purification. He taught his staff that a child without a name was a vessel ready to be filled, that identity was corruption, that the loss of self was the path to virtue. The unnamed child became a sacrifice the others were forced to witness. Their absence left a wound in the dormitory rows, a hollow that pressed into every survivor's thoughts. Each child knew it could be them the following year. Each kept their head low, their mouth closed, their laughter swallowed, in the hope that silence might protect them. And so the school grew quieter with each passing term, its halls heavy with dread, its very air dense with the weight of those who had been erased. Behind his kindness to visitors, Givens concealed a mind that delighted in this methodical cruelty. He dined with local nobles, presented reports filled with numbers, spoke of his charges as thriving. Yet in the solitude of his study he stared at the photographs pinned to his wall, rows of silent faces, one always unnamed, and he felt not sorrow but satisfaction. To him this was proof of control, proof that he had bent reality itself to his will. He hid his evil behind the language of charity, cloaking sadism in the robes of moral instruction. His school was his laboratory, his chapel, his altar. By the time dusk fell each evening, the grounds of the Givens school lay under a hush so total it felt unnatural. The silence did not come from peace, but from fear that had seeped into the stones themselves. The children learned that even breathing too loudly could draw attention, that the absence of sound was safer than the risk of a name. Each night the building seemed to exhale this dread back into the village, a breath no one wanted to acknowledge. Yet the townsfolk looked upon its towering walls and saw only charity, unaware that within those walls silence was not safety but the first stage of sacrifice. And so the house built for silence endured, its foundation already steeped in the unnamed dead, preparing for the years of lessons that would follow. At the Givens school, every lesson began with the same phrase carved into memory by repetition: obedience is salvation. The words were written above the blackboard, stitched into uniforms, murmured before meals. They were not taught as wisdom but drilled as survival, a mantra beaten into flesh until it lived beneath the skin. Arithmetic was taught not with chalk and slate alone but with posture and endurance. Children were made to stand for hours with arms outstretched, balancing books until their muscles quivered and locked. When they faltered, they were told to start again. Stillness became mathematics, pain became geometry. The body was reduced to a problem to be solved, and the answer was always submission. The catechisms of faith were no gentler. While the priest's words in Sunday sermons spoke of grace, Givens twisted the doctrine into a theology of punishment. He demanded that children repeat prayers while holding scalding irons close enough to blister the skin, the heat rising in waves until sweat ran into their eyes. To falter in the recitation was to be branded a sinner. To endure in silence was to be praised as righteous. Some children collapsed mid-verse, collapsing into the stone floor with skin raw and voices broken. Their bodies were dragged away, and when they did not return, the others were told that disobedience had claimed them. Death itself was renamed lesson, each absence folded into the school's curriculum. None of this was left to chance. Givens documented each punishment with the precision of a clerk balancing accounts. His leather-bound ledger bore neat columns: date, child's name, method applied, outcome. In these pages, pain was transformed into data, suffering into science. One entry described how long a boy could kneel on stone before fainting. Another recorded the number of burns required to silence a girl's protests forever. There were no stains of remorse in his handwriting, only careful loops and lines, the work of a man convinced he was perfecting a formula. To him, the school was not cruel but necessary, a place where weakness was shaved away until only purity remained. The drills of resistance became daily ritual. Children were lined in rows and commanded to hold their breath until their faces purpled, while assistants timed them with pocket watches. Some coughed blood, others fell limp, but Givens insisted they continue, claiming endurance of the body proved mastery of the soul. In another drill, children were submerged to their shoulders in basins of freezing water while arithmetic was shouted at them. Those who could answer correctly through chattering teeth were praised. Those who failed were left in longer, as if knowledge itself could be forced by hypothermia. Many staggered out unable to walk, their bodies trembling violently, their teeth shattered from clenching. Some never left the water at all, their final breath counted as a failed sum. Every death was explained away with ease. A child who collapsed in drills was said to have been born weak. A girl who succumbed to infection from burns was described as consumed by illness. Parents who came asking questions were shown tidy dormitories, neat beds, well-swept halls. They were told their child had been buried with respect, prayers said, the name entered in the records. But in truth, the child's name was already in Givens's ledger, not as a memorial but as proof of another completed experiment. Each entry was a trophy, each loss a validation of his theory that pain was the crucible of virtue. The effect on the survivors was no less horrifying than death. Children moved through the school like hollowed figures, bodies stiff, voices dull. They learned to watch each other suffer without flinching, for to show grief was to draw attention. Their eyes carried the weight of numbers. How many hours until they broke? How many lashes before collapse? How many children would not rise again from the floor? Compassion was starved out of them, replaced with calculation. Givens had not only bent their bodies but reshaped their minds into mirrors of his ledger, teaching them that endurance mattered more than empathy, silence, more than love. In this curriculum of pain, every scar was a certificate, every bruise a grade. Givens spoke of the children as if they were clay, their suffering the potter's wheel. Yet what he molded were not whole beings but fragments, their spirits chipped until little remained but fear. At night in the dormitories they whispered of those who had fallen, speaking not in mourning but in numbers. She lasted 6 hours, he survived 12 lashes, she held the iron until the skin peeled. Even their memories were colonized by the ledger, their grief translated into statistics. It was this transformation that Givens craved most, the proof that cruelty could not only break bodies but refashion souls. The house remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of rules alone. It was the silence of children who had learned that every sound could become data, every cry another entry in the book. The given school did not educate, it harvested. Each child became a lesson written in flesh, another experiment carried out beneath the watchful eye of a man praised as a savior. And though the village still called it charity within its walls, the curriculum grew only darker, preparing for lessons that no living child would ever forget. Beneath the dormitory, hidden by a hatch disguised as part of the floor, lay a chamber that none outside the school were meant to see. The air down there was damp, sour with mildew and old blood, the stone walls sweating as though the place itself recoiled from what it contained. Iron restraints jutted from the floor, shackles bolted into the foundation, hooks set into beams with grim precision. Survivors who lived long enough to recall it later called it the lesson room without books, a place where learning was measured not by knowledge, but by how long the human body could be kept alive in torment. Sir Thomas Givens considered it his true classroom, hidden away from the tidy dormitories and swept hallways shown to visitors. Here, beneath the floorboards, he allowed himself to work without disguise. Each lesson was arranged with methodical calm. A child was taken down through the hatch by two assistants, usually under cover of night when the others were sleeping. The silence of the dormitory masked the sounds of their descent, though those awake sometimes heard the hatch creak open and the scrape of chains below. Once inside, the child was fastened into an apparatus designed to test endurance. Givens delighted in designing these restraints himself, blending carpentry with cruelty. Some were submerged in troughs of freezing water, their heads forced under until their screams became bubbles, lifted only long enough to cough before being forced down again. Others were suspended from hooks that pierced only the skin, designed so that organs remained untouched. This way the body could endure for days while pain consumed every nerve. Children hung in that darkness, their weight pulling against their skin until it tore, and Givens stood by with a pocket watch, recording how long it took before silence fell. These were not acts of rage, but of study. Givens recorded every detail in his ledger: the time to unconsciousness, the duration of survival without food or warmth, the precise moment when voices broke and screams became whispers. He believed endurance could be measured like sums on a page, that obedience could be extracted through data. Each death, he told himself, was not an accident but a contribution to knowledge. When outsiders asked about the missing children, he explained them away as succumbing to illness or accidents. A fever, a fall, a wasting sickness. The excuses flowed as smoothly as his handwriting. Graves were dug without names while the real record remained in his locked drawer, each child reduced to numbers and outcomes. To the children who remained above ground, the chamber was both rumor and certainty. They never saw it fully, but they heard enough. At night, muffled cries sometimes drifted through the floorboards, thin and desperate, fading into silence that was worse than sound. Those who returned from the chamber were no longer themselves. They came back broken, their skin torn or blistered, their eyes hollowed out by terror. Some never spoke again, their tongues held still by fear, as if speech itself might pull them back below. Others lasted only days after their return, their bodies giving out slowly, collapsing in the dormitory while the staff declared it weakness or disease. The children learned not to ask questions, for to ask was to be noticed, and to be noticed was to risk the hatch opening beneath one's feet. Gibbons's assistants followed his orders without hesitation. Some were teachers, others local men hired for their obedience. They convinced themselves they were helping reform the wayward, that the screams below were the price of discipline. But in truth they had surrendered to his will, their morality drowned in the same water they held the children under. They watched Gibbons write in his ledger, listened to his measured voice as he counted breaths or timed silence, and they learned to see cruelty as instruction. They told themselves they were part of something greater, that society itself demanded this work. The chamber did not only break children, it reshaped adults into accomplices, their humanity drained away by routine. The victims filled not only graves but places in Gibbons's philosophy. Each was a building block in the system he imagined, each body sacrificed to prove that discipline could be extracted through suffering. He spoke of them as lessons, as if their deaths were milestones on a road toward perfection. Those who endured longest became examples, their pain held up as proof that the method worked. Those who died quickly were dismissed as flawed clay, unworthy of molding. The chamber beneath the dormitory was no accident of architecture. It was the cornerstone of his vision, the hidden foundation on which the entire school stood. And yet, even in silence, the chamber spoke. The stone walls seemed to absorb the cries and return them in whispers. Children lying in their dormitory beds swore they felt vibrations through the floor, faint tremors that mimicked a heartbeat. Some believed the chamber itself had become alive, feeding on their suffering, demanding more. The fear was not of death alone, but of erasure, of becoming another line in the ledger, another unnamed child in the photographs. Above, the school carried on with its lessons of arithmetic and scripture. Below, the true curriculum was written in flesh and silence. By the time dawn came and lessons resumed, the cries from beneath were gone, replaced by the sound of quills scratching across ledgers and children reciting in trembling voices. To the outside world, the Gibbons school remained a place of order, of discipline, of salvation for the abandoned. But the chamber beneath the dormitory held its own truth, one too terrible to be spoken aloud, that every scream had been weighed and measured, every death catalogued as progress, every child transformed into nothing more than data in the mind of a man praised as a savior. Each autumn, as the days shortened and the air grew damp, the children of the Gibbons school waited in dread for the moment they all knew would come. It did not arrive with spectacle or warning, but with quiet ceremony when Sir Thomas entered the dormitory and let his eyes sweep across the rows of pale faces. He carried no whip, no iron, no book, only silence. That silence was enough. In those moments, each child prayed not to be chosen, though they dared not whisper the words aloud. To be marked was not to be whipped or starved, but to be erased, to lose the right even to speak one's own name. The chosen one was never announced with cruelty. Instead, Gibbons placed a hand on the child's head and said softly, "Pupil." From that moment forward, the child's name was forbidden. If a friend slipped and called it, the punishment fell not on the speaker, but on the pupil, who was struck or denied food for allowing their identity to linger. Teachers, assistants, and children alike were commanded to address the chosen only with that single word. The effect was immediate. The pupil ceased to be a person and became an object of ritual. They walked the halls stripped of the most basic tether to existence, their face still present among the others, but their self already dissolving. The ritual had rules precise and unchanging. The pupil ate last and spoke never. They slept at the foot of the dormitory rows away from their peers. Their belongings were taken, their initials scratched from the wood of their desk, their names scraped from ledgers. They were allowed to recite lessons, but forbidden to say I. Every sentence had to be formed without identity, and failure brought punishment both swift and public. Even whispers of sympathy from others were crushed, for Givens taught that compassion for the nameless was corruption. He wanted the children to learn the lesson through fear, that the self could vanish at any time, not through death, but through silence. The effect was more devastating than beatings or burns. The chosen child would wander the halls with downcast eyes, desperate for someone to acknowledge them, but finding only avoidance. To speak to them was dangerous. To remember them was painful. Within weeks, their shoulders sagged, their words faltered, their laughter, once the last remnant of their childhood, disappeared altogether. They became a living ghost among the living, proof that identity could be stripped without blade or rope. Other children learned to harden themselves, to accept the erasure as natural. In time, they even began to forget the faces of those who had once been their friends, as if their absence in name erased them in memory. By spring, the pupil was always gone. The staff explained it with practiced lies, illness, a distant relative, adoption. But the children knew better. The night before the New Year's photograph, muffled movements stirred in the chapel or behind the walls. Some swore they heard splashing beneath the font, the sound of water churning as if something were being held under until still. Others whispered of scratching inside the plaster, faint at first, then frantic until it faded into silence. When dawn came, the bed at the foot of the row was empty, and no one dared to ask where the pupil had gone. The photograph was taken later that day, the children seated in stiff rows, their uniforms neat, their eyes fixed forward. Beneath the photograph, each name was written one after another except for a single space left blank. The blankness was not an oversight. It was the record of the ritual. It announced to anyone who looked closely that one child had been chosen, marked, erased. The adults praised the discipline of the image, never questioning why one name was missing, while the children saw the space for what it was, a gravestone carved in ink. To outsiders, the tradition was invisible, masked by the facade of charity and order. To the children inside, it was the most powerful lesson of all. The beatings and burnings taught pain, but the ritual of the unnamed taught fear of nothingness, fear that a life could be unmade without trace. Givens called it the highest form of purification. In his ledger, he did not bother with details. The entries simply marked pupil followed by the date of disappearance. The nameless did not deserve words, only absence. Each blank entry became a victory to him, proof that he had mastered not just bodies but memory itself. The ritual seeped into the children's thoughts long after. Even those who survived carried its poison. They hesitated to say their own names in later years, some stammering as if fearing punishment for remembering themselves. Others refused to tell their children stories of their youth, as if silence were hereditary. The weight of those annual erasures pressed upon them, a reminder that identity could be stolen more easily than breath. And so, year after year, the school consumed one more child into its walls or waters, leaving behind only a blank space and a silence that stretched deeper than death. The ritual of the unnamed child became the heart of the given school's cruelty. Not the bruises, not the chains, but the certainty that existence itself could be denied. It taught obedience more effectively than pain ever could. It taught the survivors to measure their worth in silence, to bury their laughter, to hold their names like contraband inside their chests. And for Givens, it was the clearest evidence of his philosophy. That true discipline did not end when a body fell still, but when a soul was erased. In the winter of 1863, a black carriage arrived through the iron gates of the Givens School, its wheels rolling slow over the frost-hardened earth. The man who stepped out wore gloves and a waistcoat and a face carved from calm detachment. His name was Dr. William Harrington, a rising figure in London's new psychiatric societies, known for his interest in what he called the borderlands of behavior. He had published quiet papers on emotional suppression in orphans and the medical value of fear, and had been dismissed by some for his obsession with what suffering could reveal about the mind. Sir Thomas Givens, however, had read every word. Their correspondence had been long, deliberate, and careful. Now, at last, they would meet. Givens welcomed him not as a guest, but as a kindred spirit. The children were told only that a doctor had come to observe them. They were instructed to sit straighter, speak more precisely, suppress every tremor. But Dr. Harrington was not interested in their posture. He watched their eyes, how they flinched when spoken to, how they searched for exits when entering a room. He found Givens's work extraordinary. "You've built a controlled environment," he said, "a human laboratory not bound by the errors of mercy." Givens smiled thinly. In private, the two men reviewed his ledgers, tracing the arc of suffering like doctors admiring a scar that healed clean. It was not long before the idea was raised, not of correction, not of reform, but of trials. Trials meant to test endurance not only of the body but of will. Trials meant to turn suffering into measurement. Their first editions were dietary. They divided the children into groups and measured starvation in precise increments. One group denied food for 36 hours, another for 72, another for 96. They recorded not just the physical symptoms, vomiting, tremors, hallucinations, but the moment a child began to turn inward, retreating into blankness. One boy began praying aloud to a figure he called Mother Silence, and Givens noted this as a marker of spiritual surrender. Another child gnawed open his own hand in the dormitory and was found unconscious, blood pooled beneath the mattress. Harrington praised the result. "It teaches us how the self breaks," he said, "how the child reconfigures under absence." Then came the chemicals. Laudanum, already used among the poor to quiet infants, became a tool of obedience. Administered in drops, it dulled panic but also blurred memory. They increased the dose gradually, studying how long a child could be kept docile before vomiting or collapse. In some, it brought stillness. In others, terrifying visions. One girl screamed for 6 hours about insects behind her eyes before her throat gave out. When she finally fell silent, Givens declared it a breakthrough, a reliable dosage to suppress defiance. He adjusted the formula in his ledger and buried the girl without a name. Most disturbing of all were the masks. Forged by a blacksmith who asked no questions, the iron masks were heavy with slits only for breathing. The intent was to study the effects of total facial isolation, the removal of self-expression, the forced suppression of words. Once fitted, the masks were bolted at the jaw and temples, locking the child's face into anonymity. Some wore them for days. Skin blistered and wept beneath the iron, and sores formed where bone pressed too tightly against metal. One child choked on vomit and died before the bolts could be loosened. Givens and Harrington did not consider this a failure. The body rejected its own voice, Harrington remarked. Remarkable. Children returned from these trials, altered beyond recognition. They limped through the halls, jaws slack, eyes flickering. Some no longer spoke at all. One boy continued to wear his mask even after it had been removed, his hands clamped to his face in mimicry as if its weight had imprinted into his mind. Teachers were told to reintegrate these children gently, but in truth, they were reminders. Their disfigurement was instructional. Others were told to look at them and remember that silence could be shaped not just by punishment, but by science. The failures, the children whose bodies gave out, whose minds collapsed, were removed quietly. They were buried in a shallow trench at the edge of the property, behind the chapel where weeds grew tallest. There were no crosses. Givens said it would be wrong to mark an experiment with a name. Some assistants wept as they shoveled earth, but they kept shoveling. By then, even grief had become a risk, a symptom of disloyalty. The town remained blind. Harrington gave public lectures praising the school's methods, speaking vaguely of new techniques in pediatric correctional health. Philanthropists sent more donations. One wrote that Givens had married discipline with scientific advancement, calling the institution a model for the future. No one asked about the masks. No one questioned why the children's numbers fluctuated without explanation. To Harrington and Givens, the line between cruelty and knowledge no longer existed. They believed they were witnessing evolution, not biological but moral. Suffering, Harrington wrote in a private journal, is the last frontier of education. He left the school in spring, promising to return with more supplies, more sedatives, more iron. But Givens no longer needed guidance. He had learned how to bend minds. He had seen children undone not by lashes but by needles and steel. He began drafting new experiments even before Harrington's carriage vanished down the lane. The trials had changed the school. It was no longer simply a place of punishment, but of transformation. Children no longer feared pain alone. They feared the look in Givens's eyes when he studied them too long, the rustle of a vial being drawn from his coat, the screech of metal being wheeled across the stone floor. They feared that obedience might not be enough anymore, because now the lessons were no longer about survival. They were about disappearance, about how much of a person could be stripped away before they were no longer a person at all. The cellar walls beneath the Givens school bore no paintings, no banners, no chalkboards of scripture. What they held was older, more intimate, and infinitely more disturbing. Scratched into the stone in desperate, uneven lines were hundreds of markings, initials, fragments of names, shapes of crude animals, crosses, numbers, and prayers misspelled by trembling hands. Some were shallow, hurried, vanishing into dust. Others had been gouged with such force that the walls still bore the stains of blood. The tools varied: nails torn from wooden beds, shards of slate, teeth used as chisels when nothing else remained. These were not acts of vandalism but of defiance, the last expressions of children who knew they would not return to the dormitory above. Givens discovered the first carvings in the early years and, instead of punishing them, encouraged their continuation. He believed, and would later write, that despair clarified memory. He claimed that a name etched at the edge of death was truer than any name spoken in comfort. When he brought Harrington to see the cellar for the first time, he gestured to the walls as one might to a gallery. "Proof," he said, "that even the broken seek meaning." Harrington agreed. From then on, every child brought into the cellar was given a final hour alone before the restraints were fixed. Givens called it the reflection period. He told them to leave something of themselves behind, a mark, a word, a thought, and promised that if they did so, their suffering would not be wasted. Most did. The carvings became more frequent, more detailed, even ritualized. Some children etched not only initials but full prayers. "Deliver me," or "God, see me," letters stacked atop one another in fits of panic. Others scrawled names of siblings or mothers, the letters crooked and unfinished where blood overtook patience. A few carved elaborate symbols, suns with hollow eyes, ladders rising into blankness, and no one ever deciphered what they meant. Some were so small they could only be read by candlelight, hidden between stones like secrets sealed by trembling fingers. And always, always, they were created in silence. Above, the school remained a fortress of order. When government inspectors arrived, they were led through polished corridors where children sat with hands folded and eyes lowered. The dormitories were swept, the ledgers locked away. Questions were answered with precision, and not one child spoke without permission. The inspectors saw only cleanliness and control. They never asked to see the cellar, and Givens never offered. To him, the chamber below was sacred, not for what it contained, but for what it meant. He believed the inscriptions proved that the children had been made aware of their smallness, that their suffering had forced them to see the truth of their condition. But the truth written in those walls was not his. It was theirs. The children wrote not to praise the system, but to resist it. They carved to be remembered, to scream when they could not use their voices, to inscribe what they had been forbidden to speak aloud. Their carvings were not gratitude, but accusation. Still, Givens studied the patterns like scripture. He believed the length and clarity of the messages reflected the effectiveness of his methods. Longer prayers meant longer endurance, he theorized. When he found jagged, half-finished marks, he marked those entries as premature collapse. And yet, even as he analyzed, the cellar began to take on a life of its own. Children who descended there swore they heard whispers when alone, not words, but pulses of sound that echoed from stone like breath trapped in the wall. Others said the walls felt warm beneath their fingers, as if the blood that once stained them had not dried but sunk deeper. One girl was found carving the same phrase over and over into her own arm. "Don't forget me." When questioned, she stared ahead blankly and whispered, "They told me to." Givens noted her behavior with interest. By then, the cellar had become more than a punishment chamber. It was a second curriculum hidden from records passed on only in glances and silence. Older children would point toward the floor when a new student asked where a missing classmate had gone. Some tried to memorize the carvings before their own time came. One boy, scheduled for restraint, begged to be allowed to copy a particular prayer. Givens allowed it. He was pleased by the reverence, and still the names kept vanishing. One by one, children disappeared, their absence explained away with vague phrases: withdrawn, transferred, lost to illness. Their beds were remade, their belongings burned, but on the walls beneath the floor they remained. Initials side by side with dates, symbols whose meanings had long been lost, names that could no longer be spoken above ground without punishment. Each mark was a grave carved into stone by the hand of its own occupant. Over time, the staff began avoiding the cellar unless summoned. Some said they dreamed of the walls, of fingers still scratching even after the children had died. Others refused to carry the candles, claiming they saw faces flickering behind the stains. But Givens continued to descend, notebook in hand, to study the evolving gallery. He saw not horror but success, a language of suffering, proof that his lessons had penetrated beyond flesh. The school remained immaculate on the surface, a perfect machine of silence and structure. But beneath that surface, the walls pulsed with memories that could not be erased. The etchings multiplied until there was almost no space left untouched. Even the stones seemed to buckle with their weight, as though bearing witness had left it scarred. And still no one above spoke of the cellar. It hummed beneath every lesson, its presence felt in every act of obedience, its silence louder than any scream. By the early 1870s, the walls of the Givens School could no longer contain what they were built to hide. Rumors began to drip through the cracks, not in bold accusations, but in soft, uncertain observations from those who had once applauded the place. Parish priests attending to the grounds noticed funerals without ceremony. Shallow mounds behind the chapel marked by nothing but silence. There were no names spoken, no families gathered, just assistants with shovels and stone-faced resolve. One priest quietly asked why a coffin had not been delivered for a burial. He was told the child had been too frail for embalming. The priest never returned. In the town, shopkeepers began noticing strange things when the children were marched through the square on Sundays. Some of the smaller ones had gray threaded into their hair. Others limped not from injury but from something deeper, something permanent. A baker's wife watched one boy scratch his arm raw through his coat sleeve, eyes wide and absent while the others looked away. She told her husband that the children looked older than they should, not aged by time, but by something worse. She said they moved like they had already buried parts of themselves. Whispers began to gather in kitchens, behind pews, outside church doors. People spoke of strange shadows pacing behind the school's windows at night, long after the lamps had been dimmed. Some claimed they saw faces pressed to the glass, not watching, but trapped. Faces pale and unmoving, mouths slightly open as if frozen in mid-cry. A postman passing by the grounds during an early delivery swore he heard humming coming from beneath the west dormitory, low and rhythmic like a lullaby sung from beneath the floor. Then came the fire. It began just after dusk when the oil lanterns were lit and the children were settling into their beds. No one saw who started it. The blaze erupted in the west dormitory with a suddenness that suggested intention. Flames burst through the upper windows, licking the stone and curling into the air like claws. The alarm bell rang late, too late, and when the townsfolk came running with buckets and rags, they found the gates of the school still locked. Smoke poured out from the eaves, thick and bitter, coating the air with something more than wood and cloth. As they approached, those outside claimed they saw movement through the flames. Figures still in bed, strapped down with cloth restraints, unmoving but alive. Eyes wide open, some screamed but no sound reached the streets. It was as if their voices had been taken long before the fire did. One woman swore she saw a child standing at the window, mouth gaping, arms raised as if in plea, only to vanish when the frame gave way and the roof collapsed in on itself. The fire did not spread beyond the dormitory. It consumed only what had already been broken. Givens arrived after the flames had been choked out, his coat unburned, his voice measured. He thanked the townsfolk, apologized for the electrical fault, though no one had seen wires on the property. He said some children had panicked and run and they were being searched for in the nearby woods. No one was allowed to enter the ruins. No bodies were removed publicly. No names were read. In the following week, the staff boarded up the West Wing and classes resumed in the East Hall as if nothing had happened. But the children knew. Those who survived the fire were different. They flinched at candlelight, avoided the west side of the grounds. Some refused to sleep indoors, curling on the chapel floor until the cold drove them back to their beds. One boy wept every night for a girl who had been bound beside him. He claimed she had caught fire before the flames ever touched her, that her skin had begun to blister the moment the alarm was sounded, as if something inside her had been waiting to escape. The event left its mark not just in the scorched beams and blackened bricks, but in the way silence took on new weight. The lessons continued, the routines enforced, but now the children obeyed, not out of fear alone, but out of grief. Givens never spoke of the fire again. He instructed the staff to write the event out of the annual reports. It was not a failure, he said. It was a correction. He doubled the restraints used at night. He forbade the lighting of candles past dusk, and he began to speak in whispers as though the walls themselves were listening. The town never forgot. Though no one dared confront Givens openly, attendance at school-sponsored masses dropped sharply. Donations slowed. The butcher who had once supplied discounted meat stopped delivering altogether, saying nothing as he shut his doors. But the school remained untouched. It was too large, too praised in official circles, too shielded by bureaucracy. And so the whispers grew, but the gates stayed closed. In time, new children arrived, unaware of the fire, unaware of the faces that had burned behind locked windows. But the ashes remained, in the cracks between floorboards, in the smell that no amount of lime or oil could cover, in the dreams of the survivors who woke with the taste of smoke in their mouths. The Givens school did not fall with the fire. It did not weaken. If anything, it became stronger. For now it had proved something no lesson could teach aloud, that even when innocence burned, the structure held. When Sir Thomas Givens was found dead in his study in the spring of 1878, the staff reacted not with grief, but stillness. He had died sitting upright at his desk, his hands resting calmly on the surface, as if awaiting another entry. His eyes were open, his face drained of color, but nothing in the room was disturbed. The fireplace burned low. The ink in his well had dried. The silence around him was complete. They did not call for the parish priest, only for the undertaker, and the body was taken away without procession. It was during the cleaning of his quarters that the ledger was found, tucked behind a false panel in the bottom drawer of his desk, wrapped in a cloth blackened with age and wax. The binding was leather, worn smooth at the edges. It bore no title. Just a single brass lock, cold to the touch even in spring. It was not forced open immediately. The staff hesitated. They understood without speaking that whatever was inside had not been meant to be read by anyone but Givens. But the key was there, left on the desk beside his lifeless hand. That, too, was no accident. Inside, the pages were immaculate, each line written in the same exacting hand, the ink uniform, the spacing measured. But what they held was not the language of a schoolmaster. It was a record of cruelty so methodical, so comprehensive that even those who had worked beside Givens for years turned pale. The first entries were almost clinical, names, dates, methods. But as the years progressed, the details deepened. There were headings: resistance to heat, behavioral collapse under starvation, response to prolonged submersion. One child's death was timed to the second under boiling water, with notes about blistering thresholds and nerve failure. Another was whipped until unconscious. The exact number of lashes listed beside a comment on facial dimming before collapse. But it was not just the brutality that sickened. It was the repetition. Each method had been tested multiple times. Variations were marked with care. Temperature changes, restraint substitutions, duration shifts. It became clear that no death had occurred by accident. Every child that vanished had filled a purpose. Each was a data point, a line in a long and deliberate pursuit of what Givens called, in one annotation, the absolute threshold of will. He had not punished them. He had dissected them. There were sections dedicated to what he labeled the silent trials. In these, children were buried beneath loose floorboards or sealed in wooden boxes for exact intervals, then retrieved and revived, if possible. The goal was not to kill, but to measure how silence evolved in the absence of oxygen, how breathlessness bred submission. In one case, he noted how a child emerged unable to speak for days, not from trauma, but from what he called deep conditioning. He marked the experiment a success. Another entry recorded the moment a girl's heart stopped as minute 44, followed by recovery failed, useful data nonetheless. And there, tucked at the bottom of each set of trials, were the references to the unnamed children. Never given in full, only marked as pupil entry 6, pupil entry 9. In each case, there were no outcomes, only phrases: vessel met its threshold, no further potential, sealed. The ledger made it clear that the ritual of erasure had been no symbolic lesson. It had been the final stage of his work. The unnamed were not forgotten. They were catalogued. Their disappearances were calculated components in a larger design. Some of the entries were nearly illegible from the pressure of the pen. In these, Givens seemed to abandon academic language. One passage read, "In the hour before death, clarity emerges. Their eyes do not beg. They release." Another, beneath a detailed drawing of restraints, simply stated, "To kill is nothing. To extinguish self is everything. There were diagrams, sketches of the iron masks, schematics for modified restraints that could prolong agony without cutting blood flow. One page bore a crude outline of a child's body with pressure points marked in red, labeled as optimal sites for collapse. When the staff had read enough, they sealed the book again. Some argued it should be burned, but others insisted it had to be shown. Eventually, it was turned over to the authorities. What followed was not trial or scandal, but silence. The authorities thanked the staff, took the ledger, and locked it away. No charges were brought, no memorials erected. Givens was buried in the church cemetery under a headstone that simply read, "Founder, Educator, Benefactor." The words carved with the same precision he once applied to every measurement of pain. But the staff remembered, and some of the children, now adults, began to speak in murmurs. The ledger had changed something in them. It proved that what they suffered was not the chaos of a sadist, but the cold hand of a system. They had been counted, weighed, recorded. Their pain was not incidental. It had been the purpose. And for some, this realization broke them again. The school did not close, not yet. But from that year forward, the walls seemed to listen differently, as if the stones themselves now understood what they had witnessed. The ledger was gone, but the rooms where those numbers were born remained. The echo of Givens' pen still lingered in the air, the scratch of ink into skin, into memory, into silence. And beneath every lesson that followed, the children understood the truth. They were not being taught. They were being measured. The ground behind the chapel had always been avoided. Grass there grew longer, thicker, darker than anywhere else on the school grounds. Children were told not to play there, and they never asked why. The soil sank in strange places and smelled faintly of iron after the rain. For decades, no one disturbed it. Even after the school finally closed its doors in the early 20th century, the land remained untouched, fenced off, overgrown, left to time. It wasn't until 1939, when construction crews were brought in to prepare for a proposed war-era storage depot, that the soil was broken. Shovels bit deep, striking not rock but something softer. A laborer knelt and pulled from the earth a child's ribcage, still mostly intact, with a slate board clutched between brittle arms. No one spoke at first. But by the time they unearthed the third skeleton, this one shackled at the wrists with rusted iron, the whispers had begun. What lay beneath the chapel hill was not a graveyard, but a gallery. Dozens of child-sized skeletons, some curled in fetal positions, others laid out stiff and straight. A few had been buried upright, arms stretched above their heads as if reaching for something they had never found. The bones were not scattered by decay. They were arranged, methodically, obsessively, with the same precision found in Givens's ledger. One skeleton was bound in chains around the thighs and ribcage, knees folded tightly to the chest. Another was seated cross-legged, a ruler pressed flat across the collarbone, the wood still faintly visible where it had compressed into the bone. Several were found in pairs, smaller ones wrapped around slightly larger ones as if locked into place by design. The most disturbing arrangement was uncovered just beyond the chapel's rear wall. A perfect circle of skeletal remains, 12 in total, laid shoulder to shoulder, skulls facing outward. In the center was a set of bones unlike the rest, an adult, jaw broken, kneecaps removed. No one could identify it, but the workers called it the headmaster's circle. Whether it had been Givens himself or another of his choosing, it made no difference. The meaning was clear. This was not burial. This was curriculum extended into the earth. Some skeletons had names carved crudely into buttons or slate fragments buried with them. Others had none. A few still bore fragments of fabric, collars, socks, a scrap of uniform stitched with numbers instead of letters. These, historians would later surmise, were the unnamed children, the ones who had vanished from class photos. Their bodies had not simply been hidden. They had been preserved, interred as part of a lesson plan that refused to end with death. News of the discovery reached the local authorities within hours, and the response was swift. Not with outrage, but with fear. A small team of government men arrived within 2 days. They cordoned off the site, confiscated the remains, silenced the press. The work crews were paid off and relocated to other sites. In the local paper, a single paragraph noted the delay in construction due to historical artifacts of uncertain origin. No names were printed, no images released, no further digging permitted. Behind closed doors, the evidence was boxed, tagged, and archived. Some said it was burned. Others whispered that the bones had been sent to university laboratories under falsified labels. Anonymous samples for skeletal deformation studies. No official investigation was ever launched. The school's records were declared incomplete. The land was declared not of public concern. What was left behind was not just silence. It was sanctioned silence, a silence heavy with purpose, institutional in its depth. Memorials were quietly suggested and quickly denied. A plaque was designed but never mounted. No ceremony was held, no clergy summoned, no names read. Instead, the earth was reseeded, trees planted, a bench placed beside the chapel's edge with no inscription. Visitors would sit there in spring, enjoying the breeze, never knowing what was beneath their feet. But the survivors remembered. Those who had once scratched prayers into stone, who had lain awake hearing screams rise from the floorboards, felt the discovery like a reopening wound. They spoke in private of what the bones proved, that Givens had meant for every death to endure, that his philosophy had not stopped with his heartbeat, but had sunk into soil and calcified into shape. For those who returned in secret years later to visit the grounds, the land itself felt charged, not haunted. That word would have been too easy. It felt heavy, like something waiting. They saw not ghosts, but geometries, not souls, but systems. They saw rulers as crosses, slates as gravestones, circles as cages. And though they tried to speak, they were met with disbelief or dismissal. It was a different time, officials said. It cannot be proven, others said. But in truth, no one wanted it to be proven. Because if proven, it would demand reckoning, and reckoning was more terrifying than forgetting. So silence reclaimed the ground. The bones were gone. The ledger buried in sealed archives, the school's name slowly erased from official histories. But still, beneath the trees, the pattern remained. The earth knew where each child had been placed. The roots twisted carefully around the gaps. And in spring, the grass bloomed unevenly, patches growing tall in places no one could mow, as if the land remembered the lesson and refused to let it go. The gates of the Givens School were locked for the final time in 1912. By then, the building stood like a mausoleum, Window panes cracked, shutters bowed, weeds crawling up the stone. It was not closed with scandal nor with sorrow. There was no trial, no reckoning, no confession, just a quiet decree that the building was no longer needed, that the children would be sent elsewhere. Those who sealed it said little. The papers printed even less. No one mentioned the ledger. No one dared write the names of the missing. But the silence did not erase the truth. It only buried it deeper. The survivors scattered. Some were sent to other institutions, others adopted into homes that treated them with puzzled caution, unsure what to do with children who stared too long and spoke too little. Many carried their wounds invisibly. Spines that never straightened after years of restraint, knees twisted from hours of forced kneeling, voices that rasped or vanished entirely. Some bore physical scars, yes, but it was the psychological damage that endured longest. They did not speak of the school, not because they forgot, but because they had learned that silence was safer. A few kept fragments, buttons, scraps of uniform, chipped slate boards taken in secret. One woman, decades later, confessed that she still folded her hands before every meal, waiting for permission that never came. A man once admitted that he could no longer speak his own name aloud without shaking. They did not tell their children where they had been raised. They did not want the shadows to follow. But the shadows came anyway. In how they disciplined, in how they flinched at raised voices, in how they taught obedience before joy. In the years that followed the school's closure, new laws emerged, reforms in child labor, shifts in how educational facilities were inspected, how orphanages were overseen. On paper, progress bloomed. Legislators cited the need for structure, for accountability. But Givens's name was never mentioned, not once. His school was not cited as a cautionary tale. It was quietly scrubbed from state reports, buried under layers of bureaucratic forgetfulness. History needed villains it could safely condemn. Givens was not convenient. He had operated within the rules under the guise of charity, praised by the very systems meant to protect. To acknowledge him would have required institutions to admit their complicity. So instead, they let him fade. What remained were the photographs, dozens of them stored in archives left to gather dust, rows of children in identical uniforms, postures stiff, eyes glazed. In every image, one face stood apart, not because it looked different, but because no name was written beneath it, a blank line, year after year. The same silent absence. Historians noted it as odd, but not impossible. Archivists labeled it a record-keeping oversight. But those who knew, those who survived, or Muppets remembered. That blank space was not a mistake. It was a grave carved in ink. Over time, the building decayed. Vandals broke the windows. Ivy split the mortar. A fire swept through in the 1950s, but the stone frame held. It always held. They said the walls were too thick to burn. A developer bought the land once, intending to demolish and rebuild. The machinery broke down 3 days in. Workers quit without notice. Some said they heard voices behind the walls. Others just walked away without explanation. The project was abandoned. The structure still stands today. Empty, watching. In recent years, interest has returned. A handful of academics began to dig quietly at first, cross-referencing names, examining census gaps, tracing lineage back to records that no longer exist. They found hints. Death certificates with no cause, burial plots with no bodies, inspection logs signed but never filled in. Some former students, now elderly, gave testimony, their voices shaky but unwavering. They spoke of the cellar, of the chamber beneath the dormitory, of the girl who never came back from chapel, of the fire that took only the ones already strapped to their beds. And still, no formal inquiry has been launched. The state shrugs. The records are gone. The memories are fading. What remains is the pattern, the way evil once lived inside benevolence, how it wore the skin of discipline, how it was applauded as progress. Givens was not a monster with claws and bloodied teeth. He was calm, deliberate, well-dressed. His horror was not theatrical, it was procedural. That is what made it endure. The Givens school became a lesson in silence itself, not taught but inherited. It proved that cruelty doesn't need chaos. It thrives in order. That institutions can be built to suffocate, not with fire but with paperwork. That a name can be erased not just from a ledger but from memory simply by pretending it never existed. And so, we ask, what do we do with places like this, when no one is punished, when the walls remain standing, when the names are gone? Can we say it is finished? Can we say it will not happen again? Look closely at the schools we praise today. The homes, the hospitals, the ones with uniforms, with rules, with smiling overseers and sealed doors. Look at the way obedience is demanded, at the silences that linger, at the children who don't quite look whole. What do you think? Could a school like this rise again behind the mask of benevolence?